So during my first semester of college, I woke up in the middle of the night with a tightness in my chest, pain going down my arms, some shortness of breath. And so I crawled off my lofted bed, went to my computer, searched on WebMD my symptoms, and found out that at 18 years old, I was having a heart attack. Now, this was not my plan to start off my freshman year in college with a heart attack. So I didn't take the medical advice that WebMD gave me, and I decided not to go to seek medical help. For 3 days, I walked around with that feeling, a feeling of being on edge. The best way to describe it, actually, is waiting behind this curtain to come out and give a TED Talk. After that 3 days, I decided maybe I should go check out what's going on. And I found myself going to our student health center. And at the student health center, they let me know that maybe I was having a panic attack, so they gave me some medication. They referred me to therapy, and I was off on my way. I had some relief, but still, I was just feeling tight, is the best way to describe it. In therapy, I started talking about things like self-worth and self-love and anxiety, depression, but I really didn't know what any of that meant, and I didn't know how to integrate that in my daily life. Eventually, my therapist was, understandably so, saying, hey, you need to go make some friends. And so I was referred to some campus programming, and specifically I was referred to our LGBT Resource Center. And there I joined a coming out group, my second semester. And in that coming out group, I started meeting other LGBTQ college students, and surprisingly, other students that were dealing with anxiety and that were dealing with depression. And so I started to learn that maybe there wasn't much wrong with me. Maybe I was just part of something bigger, part of other people who were just trying to make it through. So this story and many other stories have led me to want to dedicate my life to supporting college students, learning what makes college students thrive, and how we can create inclusive environments on campuses. When I started my career a little over 10 years ago, starting then, we were talking about the mental health of college students. And we knew that many college students were struggling with mental distress of some sort. That was especially true for students who were experiencing any sort of marginalization, so our students of color, our LGBTQ college students. Specifically for LGBTQ college students, for 10 years we've known that their rates of mental health or mental distress were far worse than their peers. In 2023, a study by the Trevor Project found that 67% of LGBTQ young people experience symptoms of anxiety. 54% experience symptoms of depression. And 41% of students had thoughts of suicide. And so we know that this is a problem. And so what do we do about it? So universities have been trying to do that, and there's certain things that do work well. We know that having support works, but we also know that there's something stopping that support from happening. For marginalized students, it's experiences of racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia that limit people's ability to connect to resources. And so I wanted to better understand how not only that we know that there's a problem, we've known for a while that there's a problem, but I wanted to understand how do lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer students navigate and survive and thrive in college settings, because I knew that was the case for me and so many of my friends. And so I also wanted to shift the narrative a little bit. So I looked at LGBTQ college students that identified as MAD, labeled as mentally ill, neurodivergent, and/or disabled. Now, that's a mouthful to say, so I'm just going to use the acronym QMIND as we're talking today. But one of the things I want to mention is that this shifted a little bit how we understand mental health on college campuses. Borrowing from MAD studies and disability studies, shifting mental illness, mental distress as an individualized problem towards a systemic problem, right? A problem in which we as a society might be able to solve together rather than the individual solving themselves. I read a book by Eli Clare, a disability activist, called Brilliant Imperfection. And in this book, Eli describes how our society is obsessed with curing disability. But that narrative can be harmful and is harmful, because what that might mean is that we don't want disabled people to exist. When we think about cure as the ultimate solution, that also means that disabled people don't exist in those worlds. And so what happens if you have a disability and you don't want it to be fixed or cured, and that you actually find beauty and celebrate the diversity of your body and mind? So that was the question to better understand the experiences of QMind college students. So I found many things, or many themes through that, but one I want to focus on is connection. QMind college students really wanted to connect with other people, and it was marked by a deep desire to connect. And that desire came in many different ways. But one of my co-researchers talked about how they oftentimes found themselves connecting to people who didn't care about the social rules or social norms. And that often meant that they were connecting with autistic college students and other students that had ADHD. Coupled with that desire to connect was a difficulty in connecting. When holding invisible identities, it was difficult to find connections with people like them. One co-researcher shared that they would use these subtle clues, and what they did specifically is they talked about their special interest at the moment. That special interest, if another person were to talk about that, get excited about it, or share their own special interest, they knew that they might be neurodivergent, because that is a common thing for people who have neurodivergent identities. Those subtle clues blossomed into such meaningful relationships. And then the focus came on how do we maintain connections. That maintenance was difficult for a variety of reasons, but QMind college students talked often about how they would interrupt moments when a friend got misgendered or someone used the wrong pronouns. And they felt an immense amount of responsibility to protect that connection. When someone used ableist or sanist language like, oh, that's so crazy, or everyone's a little bit OCD, they would interrupt and validate the identity of their connections to help maintain those. So connections became important, but this is not necessarily new to disability identity and activism. And so in 2005, a group of queer, trans, disabled activists of color came together to call for a new stage, an evolution in disability activism. And it's called the Disability Justice Movement. And those activists were Patty Byrne, Leroy Moore Jr., Stacy Milburn, Mia Mingus, yes, and Eli Clare. Now, they came up with 10 principles of disability justice, and I don't have time today to talk about all of those, but I want to talk about one of them, and that is interdependence. Interdependence, when I think about interdependence in the context of disability activism, I can't help but think about the disability rights movement that came from the 60s and 70s that focused on independence. And this is because at the time, disabled people were unable to determine their own, they had no agency in their own life. And so they called for independence from care workers, they called for independence from institutionalization, the right to self-determine their lives. But that focus, it lost an intersectional focus, primarily because not all of these systems that were designed to support disabled people created equal access. And so interdependence recognizes that we may need, or we actually do, we need each other to survive. And so I want to take it, for example, my story from earlier. So earlier, as I was trying to connect to these institutions, there were certain reasons why I wasn't able to integrate that into my own life. It wasn't until I found somebody like me to help me do that. But there are many other systemic barriers that prevent people's access to healthcare and to mental health care and to other institutions. And so what happens when the traditional pathways to access those services are no longer, or you're unable to access? And that's where interdependence comes in. Because in community, interdependence can help us forge different connections in different ways to access resources. The best example I have with my other story is I didn't realize that when I was feeling anxious, that in class, that I could actually use some of the techniques that my therapist shared with me. It wasn't until a friend in that coming out group shared, you want to know, Andrew, you can actually, when you're feeling anxious in class, you can use box breathing. And for those of you who don't know what box breathing is, it's a breathing technique, and if you'd like to join me, we can do that really quick. It's where you breathe in for 4 seconds. Then you hold that for 4 seconds. Breathe out for 4 seconds. And hold that for 4 seconds. Now make sure you breathe again. Okay. I tried that once and then I forgot, and I was holding my breath for too long. But anyways, what ended up, that shifted that practice for me considerably. I started to learn how I could use some of these things I was learning in my everyday life. And that really has helped me immensely moving forward. So what does this all have to do with self-love? That was the title of my talk. It's something I think about often. So I want to give you my 4 steps to self-love. The first step is to identify community. Take a second to think about who is your community. Could be family, friends, could be people you're already connected with or people you hope to connect with. Could be in person or virtual. Just take a second and think about that. The second step is to identify your needs. All of our bodies, all of our minds have different needs to be able to survive and to thrive. What is it that your body or mind need right now? What might you need in a week or a month? Just think about those needs. The third step is to identify your gifts. My friend and local disability activist, Garrett Denning, reminds me frequently that we all have gifts to give, that we actually can't be everything for everyone, but we have something important to give. So what is it that you have to give? It can just be a nice ear or shoulder to listen. Could be someone who you could send someone coffee or even a text message to let them know you're thinking of them. What is it that you can give? The last step is to celebrate interdependence. And how this step works is to take those first 3 steps and mix them all together. You take your community, your needs, and your gifts, and you celebrate the togetherness. Because only those 4 things can help us lead to self-love. So my current special interest right now is watching RuPaul's Drag Race anytime I get. And at the end of RuPaul's Drag Race, RuPaul says, if you can't love yourself, then how in the hell are you going to love anybody else? Can I get an amen? Amen. Okay, I can see where all the gays are in the room. When I first heard that initial story I told myself is that in order to love yourself, you could only do that by yourself. But the reality is that We can't love ourselves by ourselves. We have to have interdependence. And interdependence is the thing that unlocks self-love. Thank you.